Free Palestine called out the murderer of Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram and the terrorist in Boulder, Colorado who set fire to demonstrators on behalf of Israeli hostages, injuring 15 people. These terrible and despicable acts follow in the wake of the reality that many American and European Jews suddenly realized surrounded them on October 8, 2023. They were in a world in which anti-Semitic radicalism, anarchy, and violence toward Jews and supporters of Israel at large was legitimized, and it had been long ago and to a degree that they had never imagined. Part of the fight against this evil is taking place in the courts today, and we'd like to shed some light on what is being done and what more remains to be done to secure Jewish populations abroad and to push back on attempts to internationally damage Israel's just war of self-defense. I'm Aylana Meisel, Executive Director of the Israel Law and Liberty Forum, and this is Basic Law. Now, to kick off a few discussions on this topic, we're happy to first host Anne Herzberg, who's legal counsel to NGO Monitor and the organization's representative at the UN. Anne, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Glad to have you. So could you tell me a bit more about both what NGO Monitor does and your own background?
Yeah, sure. So NGO Monitor is a Jerusalem-based research organization, and we track the activities and funding of non-governmental organizations that claim to have humanitarian or human rights mandates operating in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And we look at their funding sources, their activities, and we also focus on groups that have been active in promoting anti-Semitism, anti-Israel demonization, particularly organizations in the United States, Canada, and Europe.
You had a big story in Israel the other week, right?
Yeah. I was on Channel 12 News. We had found a document that showed that the British government was participating in a cash assistance program in Gaza in conjunction with UNICEF, but they were also working with this Ministry of Social Development. And the document we found said they were working with this Ministry of Social Development in Gaza, and it said it was affiliated with Hamas. And so it did cause quite a stir last week. We had a report out that talked more in detail about these claims and caused a bit of a media firestorm. So it's been a pretty whirlwind couple of weeks.
I can imagine. So let's see how much more trouble we can make on some other issues.
There's a lot to talk about.
So, we've had these horrendous murders in the name of Free Palestine. That's clearly become something of a more global movement in the States. I think Scott Jennings called it a domestic terrorist movement at this point. And I know that you've been following the evolution of all of this, not just in the U.S., but in Canada and Europe for many years. So give us some background as to the roots of what we're seeing today on campus and off.
Yeah, so I also, from the very outset, even before, I've been calling this Free Palestine movement in the United States to be akin to the KKK or a domestic terrorist movement. I mean, I've been doing this for years, actually. But I think what came into stark relief at October 7th was just how all the pieces had come together. All the things we've been studying for nearly 20 years, more than 20 years, really came into stark relief, came to realize what exactly was going on here. I think it's important to put it into context globally, geopolitically. So first of all, I do think we are in the midst of a global conflict. I wouldn't go so far as to call it, let's say, World War III, but we definitely are in a global conflict where we have the West on the one hand, and we have actors like Iran, China, Russia, North Korea on the other. And I do think we need to look at these movements. So we have the military operations. We have our war here with Iran and the proxies, Ukraine and Russia. We have China being very aggressive in the oceans in the southern, in the Pacific, and also towards Taiwan, a lot of threats towards Taiwan. So there's that going on militarily on a global scale. But then we also have this soft power political war that's going on as well. And I do think it's an integral part of the military effort. So what we have, and again in our case, is this Free Palestine movement that we've been seeing in many countries, very extreme on campuses. And also that, unfortunately, in the past couple of weeks has led to people being murdered in the United States. And this type of violence is happening also in Europe. We saw those pogroms in Amsterdam. So it's happening a lot of places. And I do think the first thing we need to do is really put what's happening into context. I don't think we should be divorcing it and just say, oh, it's just the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's just what's going on with the Palestinians. I think that's what a lot of people are trying to do. But I think if we put it into this larger geopolitical context of what's been going on, I think it makes things a lot clearer and helps us analyze what's happening in a better way.
It's an important point.
So one of the things we need to know is prior to October 7th, and this really was going on for almost 20 years, was especially on campuses, there was a real effort of the Free Palestine movement to basically soften the ground for what happened post October 7th. So we saw things, extreme anti-Israel demonization. I actually, you had asked about my backgrounds earlier. So I was on campuses in the 90s. I went to Oberlin College, which was a radical left college in America. And then I went to law school at Columbia. So I'm well aware of these environments, but what we've seen beginning again in the early 2000s was nothing like I experienced on campus at the time. There were a few things where you sort of had glimpses of it, but it wasn't like anything that had happened later, post 9/11. But so what we saw happening, and this happened after the Second Intifada, the breakdown of the Camp David agreements, but also really post 9/11, we started to see extreme demonization and delegitimization of Israel on campus coming from faculty members. You may remember, and I believe it was 2006, Columbia allowed Iranian President Ahmadinejad to speak on campus, which was an outrageous act. I don't think a campus would have allowed Hitler to speak. I mean, just, why would you give a platform to someone like that? I thought that was quite outrageous, but it was indicative. The BDS movement on campuses became very big around that time.
But that has its own kind of organizational ecosystem behind it that you've been looking.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is when you start looking at the overlaps between the two, I think that's why it's important to look back at the history and then show how a lot of the organizations that were involved in this activism then also were very integral to this Free Palestine movement that's been taking place in the U.S.
Right.
So you have Israel Apartheid Week, like that became very big on campuses. You had this mass apartheid campaign a few years ago. And what we saw was there were two NGOs that were organizations that were very prominent in this on campuses. One was Students for Justice in Palestine, and the other one was Jewish Voice for Peace. So they were very active in these campaigns. They have overlapping funders. They did a lot of coordination. They played a very significant role and different roles. I mean, they worked together, obviously, but also coordinating roles where you had JVP kind of was like the Jewish bloc, to give cover against, let's say, anti-Semitism. Well, we have all these Jews involved. And this was a tactic that the Soviets, for instance, used a lot in their anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist campaigns. They would highlight Jews. So and even throughout history, you see the dissident Jew who's condemning the Jewish state or the Jews.
So JVP's role was basically to give that kind of cover,
yeah.
While SJP did what?
So, and then SJP was the more radical, they did work together, but SJP was sort of they would be providing a lot of the materials, a lot of the talking points, a lot of the organization. Again, they were both playing a function, but JVP had a very specific function. And they even said in their founding materials that we are there to create a wedge between in the Jewish community on the issue of Israel.
So these are the two organizations that you would signal out on the American.
Well, so they were very active prior to October 7th.
Right.
And then afterwards as well. But I think what we saw after October 7th was and I do believe there was some coordination beforehand with some of the groups. But what I think we saw after October 7th was I wouldn't say a merger, but let's say closely working together, these radical left communist socialist groups in the United States, then merging with these Palestinian activist groups. So you had there's one I think called the People's Forum, kind of these they were very active, let's say, in this Occupy Wall Street movement you may have heard about years ago, the George Floyd protests. I actually think the George Floyd protests were very important because it was a couple years before October 7th, and it really allowed these networks to coalesce and also try out strategies, activist strategies, mass protest strategies, which really then enhanced what happened after October 7th, because they had tested a lot of these methods during these George Floyd protests, these mass protests we all saw at that time. And so it was very easy for them, I think, to scale up.
So methods is recruiting people and the kind of tactics that they use in terms of the propaganda, the violence.
Yeah, organizing also, recruiting people, like the encampments, blocking roads, these types of tactics that were being used.
I actually don't remember as much of it on the college campuses in the States, but of course I wasn't there.
Yeah, I don't believe it was on the campuses, but I do think the same types of organizing tactics
are being
applied now on the campuses. But certainly we've been seeing it on the streets as well. It's not just, we saw at the Democratic National Convention, we saw a lot of we've been seeing street protests anyway, in addition to the campuses,
right,
post October 7th, but also, targeting events, let's say like the Democratic National Committee convention, and various other events. And unfortunately, AIPAC, when AIPAC has meetings, there's a lot of demonstrating in front of their meetings, that type of thing. So it morphed a lot to the campuses.
Okay, so it's over 20 years of laying the groundwork on the campuses.
Mm-hmm.
I think JVP is maybe a little newer.
No, they've been around a long time. Yeah.
I should have closer attention 20 years ago. Okay, so then they're laying the groundwork on the campuses, and then there are all of these other sort of, as I think you mentioned, kind of leftist or Marxist groups affiliated to other causes in kind of the intersectional space.
Right.
Perhaps.
Right.
And then they join forces and start exchanging best practice tips.
I'll just say another important element to these protests is the involvement of groups connected to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
So I was going to ask.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
No, please.
Yeah, no. So that's also something we've been seeing. Now, we saw it before.
You may have to give a little more background as to what.
Sure.
I feel like I'm in a
PFLP.
sketch,
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
PFLP is.
Yeah. So the PFLP is a Palestinian terrorist organization. It's been around since the 60s, late 60s, maybe even a little bit earlier, early 60s. They were well known in the late 60s and 70s for hijacking airplanes, but also have committed over the years very egregious terrorist attacks, the murder of the Fogel family. In recent years, also, there was a shooting attack at a synagogue in Harnof. So over many horrible terror attacks over the years, they were designated by the United States as a terrorist organization. The EU designates them. Several countries designate them as a terrorist organization. And they also participated in October 7th. And at NGO Monitor, beginning in 2007, we began noticing that a lot of the most prominent Palestinian, quote unquote, human rights NGOs had links to the PFLP. So we began documenting that way back when.
What kind of links?
So some of them were actually PFLP members. They had been in jail before as doing things with the PFLP. In 2019, several officials at some NGOs did a terror attack where they killed Rena Schnurb in a bombing. They were from the PFLP. One of the leaders of the PFLP in the West Bank, had been affiliated with several prominent NGOs. She had been jailed. She actually got released when one of the hostage exchanges recently. So it's a documented, it's a well-known documented phenomenon. But we, like I said, I started looking into this back in 2007 when we noticed it. And their materials, they've been active. A lot of times their visas were denied. Some of the more senior officials had denied visas, so they couldn't travel to the U.S. But they did have employees working in the U.S., some working at universities who were affiliated with these organizations. And some of these campuses were where the worst sort of anti-Israel, anti-Semitic activity was taking place, was on these campuses. We documented a couple times where legal clinics at prominent law schools were doing joint briefs with some of these PFLP NGOs.
Do you know which law schools?
So Harvard did a notable one, and CUNY Law did a notable brief from a clinic. And
2 years ago, the CUNY one.
It was before COVID. And then Harvard was a few years ago. So that was going on before. But then post October 7th, and again, this is a group we had also been tracking for many years. We didn't really notice them being as active on campuses until October 7th. But there was a group called Samidun, and they've been very active in being co-sponsors of the protests. They did this event they were part of an event at Columbia called Resistance 101, where basically they were training students how to be disruptive on campus, support for terrorism. And because of that, now the work we had done, they had been banned in Germany and some of their affiliate type groups in France. So in Europe, some of the principals had blocked visas to entering the EU because two of the principals are in Canada, actually. But the Canadian government and the U.S. government, in a joint decision in 2024, declared them as terrorist organizations. This Samidun group.
But Samidun is still operational in.
So one of the principals and the group were declared as terrorists.
Right.
But the other person who's a principal in the group so far has not been, and you see her name pop up a lot still in these activities on campuses.
In the organizing of the protests, the engagements, the so on and so forth. Okay.
Right. So it's unknown to what degree she's still involved. I don't know, but you still see her name popping up,
Okay.
But again, it just shows that it's not just, I think that's what people need to know. It's not just, it's these organic student groups. No, these are, and let's say also with SJP. So there's a national SJP. SJP is very interesting because there's a lot we don't know about SJP. They have chapters on many campuses, but they also have a national SJP. And so it's unknown, how does it work exactly? Like, do the chapters get financing from the national SJP? Do they get orders, materials? Like, what's going on there? That's unknown.
Interesting.
And then you have, there's an SJP gets support from a group called American Muslims for Palestine.
Right.
Again, the level of coordination, the extent of the coordination is not known. How they interact, let's say, with Samidun or some of these other terror-linked groups, we don't know. So there's a lot of unknowns, but I do think it's very important that people realize that the groups that have been doing these creating this chaos on the streets and campuses of the United States, again, it's part of a very organized movement. And that's really important. And again, we also don't know funding, whether that funding is coming. We know which we can get into, some of the funding if you want to.
I was going to ask about that now.
Yeah. So the funding is also not transparent in a lot of cases. So we have some of the funding we know. Some of the organizations are registered 501c3s, which is a registered nonprofit in the United States.
Have financial disclosure responsibilities.
Right. So some of the groups we know, some big foundations like the Open Society Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation give money to some of these groups or have given money. So we know that money. A lot of the money, though, is not known because many of these groups, like SJP, like there's a group called Within Our Lifetime, which has also been very active in these protests. They're getting what is known as fiscal sponsorship from large foundations. So there's something called the Tides Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, a foundation, if they're giving grants,
Mm-hmm.
has to disclose, and it's publicly available, how much money they're giving to an organization in a grant.
But they will only disclose what they're giving to the fiscal
But with
sponsor.
the fiscal sponsor, you don't know how much the fiscal sponsor is giving.
Oh, okay.
So, for instance, and then there's another foundation called Westpac, which fiscally sponsors SJP and Within Our Lifetime and a couple other groups. Now, they were also getting money from Tides. Now, in the case of Westpac, Tides gave a grant to Westpac. So we know that amount because Tides gave a grant. So we know what they gave to Westpac. But we don't know what Westpac gives to the sponsors. And what you also don't know is who gave the money to Tides. That's the other thing.
Okay.
And there are also found funding vehicles such as a lot of companies, like Goldman Sachs, has these charity funds where people can give them money and they'll give a grant.
Right.
And it's usually like they're donor advised funds.
Yeah.
And so that's also, it'll say on the groups that are transparent, it might say, oh, we got a grant from Goldman Sachs, but you don't know who gave the money to Goldman Sachs. So it's a way to hide the money. And there have been reports. So there's been a lot in the news about Qatari funding. And the U.S. government has said they believe Iran is sponsoring some of these activities. But for instance, there's a foundation that's very tied apparently to the Chinese regime, and they have been giving millions of dollars to a lot of these groups. Not necessarily the ones I mentioned, but other similar types of groups. And so that could be reflective of Chinese influence. So there's a lot of money that we just don't know where it's coming from.
So I mean, some of these funding instruments are perfectly legitimate and used in a lot of positive context too in the C3 world. I'm just wondering if you were, let's say, a policymaker, and you had to think about measures that you would propose to try and ensure more transparency here. How would you do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of fiscal sponsorship, I think there has to be some transparency there. How much money is the fiscal sponsor giving? What is the nature of the sponsorship? Because it's unknown. What does that mean? We've even been trying to find that out. Does that mean you're giving money, logistical support, sharing employees? What does that even mean, fiscal sponsorship?
And that would be a key to really understanding how much power these groups have and to potentially limiting it.
Yeah, I think that's something important. And also, I think other things that could be done are perhaps these donor advised funds. You have to say where that money came from. Something
that kind of destroys the point of the donor advice.
Right. You have to sort of think about it. You have to think about the consequences. Another thing, though, could be transparency, like what we have here in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
We have a transparency law. So if you're dealing with foreign government funding, it has to be disclosed every quarter. Any organization getting foreign government funding has to disclose that.
And that's not the case in the States?
No. So there's a Foreign Agent Registrations Act. So if you're lobbying on behalf of a foreign entity, you have to disclose it. But there's not for funding. So I think that's something that potentially, at least it needs to be explored, to see if it's the right thing to do or what the negative consequences could be for doing it. But it's definitely ripe for looking into, definitely.
So we had spoken prior to this interview. You mentioned that your research, or NGO Monitor's research, was figuring into a couple of cases at least that are currently ongoing. And then you mentioned Westpac, I think, and SJP as defendants.
So there's a lot of, so since October 7th, there's been a host of organizations that have been sued for activities on the campuses. So last I looked, there were at least 10. There may be more at this point. Some of them have been against SJP in several states. So we have Virginia, California, New York. There have been multiple lawsuits in some of the states, but essentially looking at, and there's also been against AMP, American Muslims for Palestine.
And what are they being charged with?
Westpac. So these are civil suits being brought by students. In April, this was a very interesting case in New York. There was a lawsuit brought against some of these organizations, leaders, student leaders, or other leaders of these organizations. There was a takeover there was an encampment at Columbia University, and there was a takeover of one of the halls, Hamilton Hall, I believe. And there were 2 janitors that were working in the hall at the time of the takeover, and they were essentially taken hostage. They were not allowed to leave the building.
Yeah.
And basically they alleged they were harassed, assaulted. And so they sued some of these groups and some of the student leaders. So that was at the end of April. So the proceedings most of them are still in the middle of the proceedings.
Right.
I think the interesting part about these cases, though, is in the United States, you have what's known as discovery in litigation, and you can get a lot of information in discovery, how the funding works, information on meetings. So it's a very good way in which to really uncover what's been happening, how these groups are organizing, who's paying for these groups. So hopefully these cases will continue through the stages in litigation. It won't be dismissed. Because if it's not dismissed, then you do get to the discovery stage. And like I said, a lot of information can be uncovered. In one of the cases in Virginia, a court has ordered that AMP has to disclose its financing, and it's been resisting doing that. But there's a court order recently that said, no, you have to disclose the financing. So that's going to be fascinating to see what happens, because that's one of the main groups where it's really unknown how they're getting their money.
Well, where's law enforcement in all this? If you have, I don't know if it's documented terror. In some cases, it's documented terror ties. In other cases, it's clearly suggestive relationships with terror organizations. So where are they?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was what was most, I would say, troubling to me when all of this first started. Was it did seem like there was a lack of law enforcement. There didn't seem to be. A lot of these people, let's say, maybe were arrested, but then they were immediately let go. So there were no consequences for what they were doing. The schools.
But the situation's supposed to have improved at this point.
Yeah, it does seem like it's improved. So, I mean, one area we saw at least last year was Congress was starting to investigate in the House, at the House level. When the new administration came in, there appears to be now investigations going on in the Senate and the House. So that's very important.
Investigations of these organizations, of the campuses?
Both.
Everything. Okay.
Yeah, everything. And then we have in Virginia, for instance, the Attorney General is investigating AMP, I believe. So there's some state investigations going on. But I do think, and I don't know if it's been happening, but I do think, where is the Department of Justice or the Department of Homeland Security in investigating, did they investigate Sammy Dune? I don't know. I don't know. I'm not privy to that information. For instance, how Sammy Dune got designated in the U.S. by the U.S. government last year. So was it that the law enforcement in New York was investigating how they had this role in these campus protests, what was going on there? But there's a real opportunity, I believe, for law enforcement agencies to really start looking into some of this to try to figure it out. Who's financing it? What are these people about? In some cases, the case of Mahmoud Khalil, I don't know.
Talk to me about that.
So he was arrested in, I believe it was April. He was arrested for being in America he was at Columbia and was one of the leaders of this Columbia. It was called QAD, Columbia University Apartheid Divest, and they were one of the leaders in all of these campus protests, or in all the violence, harassment, all these things going on. And he was arrested he was arrested to be deported. Basically, the Trump administration adopted a policy: we're going to deport people who, he had a green card.
This was kind of like patient zero for the policy.
Exactly. So he wasn't in the U.S. illegally, but he originally entered, I believe, on a student visa. I think at that point, though, when he was arrested, he was on a green card already, was no longer on a student visa, but they were going to deport him for, I think the reason was they said he lied on his application, his immigration application, but I think it was also because he was being an agitator, So that's been proceeding through the courts. He's in jail, I believe, in Louisiana while the proceedings continue, like in an immigration facility. He could leave, he could self-deport, but he's trying to fight it because he's a symbol now. He wants to be a martyr for the cause. But he's a very interesting case. So on his background, he worked at UNRWA. He has an Algerian and a Syrian passport, apparently. He only, I believe, came to the U.S. in 2022, and all of a sudden, by October 2023, was helping to lead this QAD group. So, somebody like that's, to me, an interesting case. I don't know, but it does seem strange. He came to the U.S. a short time before. I don't know how actually he got a green card so quickly. I find that quite interesting also. It usually takes people a long time, as far as I know, to get that type legal permanent residency. So, that's something that's an opportunity. Again, is his background being investigated? It's kind of a strange background. So there's a lot of unknowns, that I do think there are opportunities for law enforcement and the government can look in to see who are part of these networks, how are they being financed, what's going on here.
So it seems to me that a lot of the political measures that are being adopted, I mean, you're saying that the House and Senate are also investigating these organizations already. So that's promising. I mean, it seems to me until now, let's say the measures imposed by the executive going after various institutions of higher education are really penalizing those institutions and not at least putting this ecosystem of organizations front and center. But you're saying that's, the campuses are their own story, but these organizations are functioning on and off and really, really affecting the culture, agitating. I assume that they also have very active online presences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it depends. That's the thing. There's a lot of intersection between on the campuses, off the campus. Some of them have been banned from social media, actually, because of the inflammatory content they were putting on. But yeah, exactly. It's an opportunity to really see how this all works.
Fantastic. I wish you much, much success in your continued good work. I hope to have you back on again. And thank you very much for sharing your wisdom.
Thanks a lot. Great to be here.